All right, get ready because today we're going deep into the world of anthropologist and activist David Graeber.
A fascinating figure.
Yeah.
He wasn't afraid to challenge those assumptions we often take for granted. You know, the status quo.
Oh, yeah. He poked and prodded and made us really think.
Exactly.
Made us a little uncomfortable sometimes, which is good.
Absolutely. He was a firebrand, both a rigorous academic and a passionate advocate for social change.
Yeah, I noticed in the research that he's deeply embedded in academia, but also a really sharp critic of its limitations.
You see this tension playing out throughout his work.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And what I'm really excited about for this deep dive is that we've got all these different types of sources.
Oh, for sure.
We've got excerpts from his essays, interviews where he really digs deep into his ideas, and even some academic debates where his views, well, let's just say, spark some serious controversy.
Oh, yeah. He definitely ruffled some feathers.
Which makes it fun for us.
Makes it interesting, right?
So our mission today is to unpack how Graeber challenged conventional thinking. And he did it across so many different areas.
Economics, history, politics.
And even our understanding of human nature itself.
He really wanted us to re-examine those ideas we often just accept without question.
I like that. Let's start with this idea of Graeber as the academic outsider. I mean, it's almost paradoxical.
Right.
He was this respected scholar, published tons of books,
Highly influential.
but he wasn't afraid to criticize the very system that gave him a platform.
Yeah, there's this quote where he questions the concept of tenure, the idea that academics are protected.
Right.
So they can explore radical ideas without the fear of losing their job.
So they can be dangerous.
But Graeber argues that in reality, it often ends up stifling those very ideas.
Stifling the ideas that it's meant to protect.
He suggests that by the time you reach that point of security, you've maybe forgotten what it means to truly challenge the status quo.
It's kind of like that saying, the nail that sticks out gets hammered down. Even in those spaces that claim to value free thinking, there's often this subtle pressure to conform.
It's an interesting tension.
Yeah. I bet a lot of our listeners out there have experienced that.
For sure.
Maybe not at academia, but in their workplaces.
Or even within their families or their friend groups.
Like you have this great idea, but you hesitate to share it.
Because you just sense it might not be well received.
You're afraid of the hammer.
Exactly.
Graeber seemed very aware of that tension.
He was.
Between wanting to challenge those norms and wanting to fit in. And I think that gets to the heart of what he was trying to do.
Absolutely.
Which was to change our common sense. Those shared assumptions that shape how we see the world.
And not just his own common sense, right? He believed this change was a collective project.
A collective project, interesting.
And he saw language as a key battleground in that struggle. He gives this fascinating example of how the word inequality became much more prominent in political discourse after the Occupy Wall Street movement.
Oh, yeah.
He saw it as a sign that the movement, which he was heavily involved in, had actually shifted the terms of the debate.
Almost like forced people to talk about it.
Exactly. It's amazing how a movement can change the language we use.
Right. Like it wasn't just activists or academics using that word anymore. Even conservative politicians started using it.
They had to address it.
Yeah, they had to address it.
Which, for Graeber, meant that the movement had forced them to acknowledge an issue they might have preferred to ignore.
It's interesting, too. I found that he's often credited with that iconic "We are the 99% slogan from Occupy Wall Street.
Right. It's such a powerful slogan.
It is, but he always insisted that it was a collective creation. He saw it as something that emerged organically from the energy and ideas of the movement itself.
He didn't want to take credit for it.
I think that's a good reminder that language is constantly evolving.
It is.
That social movements can have a real impact on how we talk about the world.
And how we think about it.
So I'm curious about some of the thinkers who influenced Graeber's ideas, because I know he drew from some pretty unexpected sources.
Yes, his thinking was shaped by a really interesting blend of anthropology and radical social theory.
So where do we start?
Well, he was heavily influenced by Marshall Sahlins, his anthropology professor at the University of Chicago.
I remember Sahlins from my own studies.
Oh, yeah.
He's known for challenging those Western economic and cultural models.
Right, and Graeber took those critiques even further.
But then he brings in these less conventional influences as well.
He did. He was really drawn to Russian thinkers like Peter Kropotkin and Mikhail Bakunin.
Those names ring a bell.
Both anarchist theorists who had a profound impact on his worldview.
So they offered alternative ways of understanding human society.
And organization.
Okay, so we've got anthropology and anarchism.
And then there's this incredible anecdote about the only 2 books Graeber took with him to Madagascar for his fieldwork.
2 books for fieldwork, that's it.
Dostoevsky's Brothers, Karamazov, and Bakhtin's Rabelais and His World.
Out of all the books.
You think he'd take some field guides or something practical.
Right, exactly. Or at least something a little lighter.
But no, these were dense philosophical works.
Makes you wonder what he was thinking.
I think it speaks volumes about the questions that he was grappling with.
Okay.
Both Dostoevsky and Bakhtin explored the complexities of human nature and how it's shaped through our social interactions.
So not this idea that we're born with a fixed set of characteristics.
Right, they challenged that idea.
Okay.
Suggesting instead that it's constantly evolving through our relationships with others.
So we're not inherently good or bad.
Not predetermined.
But we're shaped by those interactions.
Precisely. And this leads us to one of Graeber's most provocative arguments, his critique of what he calls the myth of Western democracy.
Now, that is a bold claim.
He challenges that widespread assumption that democracy was this uniquely Western invention that originated in ancient Greece.
We hear that narrative everywhere, though.
Right, in textbooks, in political speeches.
In casual conversations.
But Graeber argues that this idea actually gained traction much later in the 19th century.
So during the peak of European colonialism.
Exactly.
At a time when European powers were justifying their colonial projects around the world.
Makes sense, right? If you can claim that democracy is this unique product of Western civilization,
it becomes much easier to justify imposing your own political systems on other parts of the world.
It's a way of legitimizing colonial expansion.
Exactly.
I also found it fascinating how Graeber points out that many early proponents of democracy held views that we would find completely abhorrent today.
Like supporting slavery
Yeah.
or opposing women's suffrage.
It really makes you question what democracy actually meant in those contexts.
Right. It was very different from our understanding of it today.
It highlights the fact that it's always been contested and evolving.
Not a static ideal, but something that people have constantly struggled over.
And redefined throughout history.
And Graeber was adamant that this struggle wasn't limited to the West.
He emphasized how the idea of democracy was actively reclaimed by groups all over the world.
So they weren't just passively accepting Western ideas.
No, they were drawing on their own traditions and histories to challenge that dominant narrative.
I like that. So give me some examples.
He talks about how Indian historians pointed to ancient examples of democratic practices in South Asia.
Pushing back against the Eurocentric narrative.
Exactly, and in Madagascar. He observed how the Malagasy people defined their own culture and traditions in direct contrast to the colonial powers who were trying to impose their systems on them.
So it's about reclaiming their own agency.
Yes, asserting their own ways of doing things.
It's fascinating how in all these cases you see elites.
Or aspiring elites.
Using the idea of democracy to legitimize their forms of government.
It becomes a tool for shaping power dynamics.
So it's not just about this pure abstract ideal.
Right.
It's about how that idea gets used and contested in different social and political contexts.
And I think it raises an important question for all of us listening. How do you see the idea of democracy being used or contested in the world today?
It's a good question to consider, right?
Yeah.
Because it's not just some historical artifact. It's something that's still very much alive and evolving.
Absolutely. And Graeber goes even further, arguing that the very idea of the democratic state itself is inherently contradictory.
Especially the globalized world.
Right. He points out that as the scale of decision-making becomes more global, it becomes harder and harder to maintain any pretense of popular sovereignty.
Who really has a voice in the decisions made by international institutions?
Like the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund.
Yeah, it's like the bigger and more complex those institutions become, the less democratic they actually are.
And he contrasts this with the approach taken by the Zapatistas.
The Zapatistas, remind me.
They're a revolutionary indigenous movement in Mexico.
Oh, right.
And they essentially bypassed the state altogether, focusing instead on self-organization and autonomous communities.
That's a pretty radical idea, isn't it?
It is, but it gets to the heart of Graeber's question. Can democracy thrive outside of those traditional state structures?
So maybe it's not about reforming the existing system,
but about creating something entirely new.
And this is where Graeber's work on debt becomes incredibly relevant.
His book, Debt, The First 5,000 Years, was a groundbreaking analysis of how debt operates not just as this economic relationship, but as a tool of social and political power.
So it's not just about dollars and cents.
No, it's about power dynamics.
Interesting.
He argued that throughout history, debt has been used to create and enforce social hierarchies.
To extract resources.
From the poor.
And transfer them to the wealthy.
It's a mechanism of control that transcends those purely economic considerations.
And there's that great anecdote about Graeber's experience in Germany, where he was surprised to find that even bankers were open to the idea of debt jubilees.
These periodic cancellations of debt.
That have been practiced in many societies throughout history.
It suggests that even within the financial establishment, there's a recognition that debt can become unsustainable.
And that sometimes a clean slate is necessary.
For societies to function.
Makes you think, right? How do you see debt operating in your own life and in the larger world? Is it simply an economic tool? Or is it something more, something that shapes relationships and power dynamics?
It's a question worth pondering.
Definitely. And Graeber's critique of mainstream economics is equally important.
Oh, absolutely. He challenged those assumptions of rational self-interest that underpin so many economic models.
You know, those models that assume humans are these perfectly rational actors.
Always making calculated decisions to maximize their own gain.
But real life is just messier than that, isn't it?
Much messier.
We're driven by emotions, by social norms.
All sorts of factors that don't fit neatly into those models.
And he even points out that the Bank of England,
not exactly known for radical thinking.
Right, not exactly a hotbed of revolution.
Has acknowledged the flaws in the quantity theory of money, a key tenet of mainstream economics.
So even the institutions are starting to recognize the limitations.
And Graeber's work contributed to this growing field of heterodox economics,
which challenges the assumptions of that dominant paradigm.
He was a real pioneer in pushing for a more nuanced and realistic understanding of how economies actually work.
And this is where things get really interesting, because Graeber coined this term bullshit jobs.
Yeah, love that term.
To describe work that's perceived as meaningless and unnecessary.
By those who actually perform it.
And he argued that these jobs are on the rise, particularly in sectors like finance, administration, and marketing.
He linked this to what he called managerial feudalism, this expanding class of managers and administrators.
To create work for each other.
Even though much of it doesn't actually contribute anything meaningful to society.
So it's a self-perpetuating system of pointless activity.
Exactly.
And the amazing thing is that this isn't just some fringe theory. Studies have shown that a significant percentage of employees believe their jobs are pointless.
Like somewhere between 37% and 40% in one study.
It's staggering, and it makes you wonder, right?
It does.
Has anyone out there listening encountered what they might consider to be bullshit jobs in their own work or in the world around them? It's a question worth pondering, Anne.
I mean, it really makes you question the whole nature of work in modern society.
What are we actually doing with our time?
And it's interesting how Graeber contrasts those bullshit jobs with the work of caring for others. Which is so often undervalued and underpaid despite its vital importance.
It seems like he's getting at this fundamental societal imbalance.
Right. He points out that societies often prioritize the production of things over the production of people.
Which makes sense if you think about how we value different types of work.
The people who care for the sick, the elderly,
the young,
those who do the essential work of maintaining human life.
They're often the least respected and financially rewarded.
And Graeber suggests that this revolt of the caring classes might be a key driver of social change in the future.
As people demand recognition and support for the work that truly matters.
It's an interesting thought.
Yeah, it is. So to dig a little deeper into Graeber's analysis of power and violence,
we need to explore his essay, Dead Zones of the Imagination.
It's a bit of a challenging read, but it's worth the effort.
In it, he explores the connection between structural violence,
bureaucracy,
and the limits of human imagination.
It's like he's saying that these systems actually constrain our ability to imagine alternative ways of being.
One of his key observations is that people often perceive bureaucratic procedures as stupid.
Illogical.
But he argues that this isn't because they're inherently flawed. It's because they're rooted in the threat of force, rather than reasoned argument.
So the rules exist not because they make sense.
No.
But because they're backed up by the power of the state.
That control.
And I love how he uses that anecdote about his own frustrating encounter with a notary.
who had no idea how to fill out a simple power of attorney form.
And it perfectly captures the absurdity of those processes.
Well, we encounter them all the time.
Yeah, like we get so caught up in the rules
That we lose sight of the human beings.
who are impacted by them.
And that system keeps chugging along, regardless.
Now, his essay on bullying is equally brilliant.
And disturbing.
He develops this theory of the deep structure of bullying.
Which I think helps explain why it's so pervasive.
Right, why we see it everywhere.
He breaks it down into this triangular dynamic.
The bully, the victim, and the audience.
And he points out that the bully often relies on the victim's reaction to justify that initial aggression.
Like classic blaming the victim.
They provoke a response.
And then they use that to say, see, they deserved it.
Exactly. It's a way of shifting the blame.
And it's not just in schoolyards.
This dynamic plays out in all sorts of social and political contexts.
He calls it the "you two cut it out" fallacy.
Where people who witness injustice avoid taking sides.
As if both parties are equally to blame.
It's a way of avoiding responsibility.
And allowing those systems of power to continue.
And this is where things take a bit of an interesting turn.
We're going to talk about puppets.
Graeber wrote this whole essay on the role of giant puppets in protest movements.
And it might seem like a lighthearted topic.
But he delves into their significance in a really profound way.
So he saw these puppets as both playful
and politically powerful symbols.
And they represent a challenge to authority.
An assertion of creativity and imagination.
In the face of power.
And he contrasts this with the tactics of the police.
Right. He has this anecdote about his experience with a black bloc protest in Philadelphia.
Where he observed these very different rules of engagement.
So the police rely on violence and intimidation.
To maintain order.
But the protesters use creativity, humor, spectacle
disrupt that order.
To challenge the legitimacy of the state.
And those giant puppets really embody that spirit.
It's like a way of saying, we're not afraid of you.
We're going to use our imaginations to create a different world.
So it brings us back to this idea of imagination as a tool for change.
Graeber really saw play and creativity as fundamental to human nature.
To the possibility of social change.
He drew inspiration from the work of Peter Kropotkin,
who argued that cooperation and mutual aid are just as essential to evolution as competition.
And Graeber takes this idea even further, suggesting that even at the most fundamental level of reality,
at the level of particles and atoms,
there's this element of ludic freedom.
This playfulness, this spontaneity.
It's a radical concept.
It really is.
It challenges us to rethink our assumptions about the nature of reality itself.
Wow, so if even electrons can be said to have a kind of freedom.
What does that say about the possibilities for human freedom and creativity?
It's a profound question that Graeber leaves us to ponder.
And I think for you, dear listener, I want to leave you with this final thought. It really challenges us to see ourselves and the world around us with new eyes.
It does. If even those tiny particles have this inherent freedom, this ludic freedom.
It's a spark of playfulness, right?
Yeah, then what are we capable of as human beings?
It really makes you think.
It does. And it feels like he's giving us permission to break free from those limitations we often place in ourselves. You know, those dead zones of the imagination.
The things that hold us back.
Yeah, bureaucracy, structural violence, all those forces that try to confine us.
Limit our thinking.
Exactly. But Graeber gives us the tools to push back.
To challenge those limitations.
So how do we do that? How do we break free from those limitations in our everyday lives? It can feel so overwhelming.
It's a good question, and it starts with awareness.
Awareness of what?
Of when you're feeling stuck, when you're accepting things as they are without questioning them.
Just going with the flow even when it doesn't feel right.
Exactly. Remember Graeber's experience with that notary who didn't even know how to fill out a simple form?
Oh, yeah. That was a classic example.
He could have just gone along with that absurd bureaucratic process.
But he didn't.
No. He used it as an opportunity to expose the absurdity of it all.
It's like he was saying, hey, this doesn't have to be this way. We can do better.
Exactly. He wasn't just going to blindly accept a broken system.
And that's what we should all strive for. Right?
Absolutely. Look for those moments in your own life. When you encounter those dead zones, those systems that feel pointless or unjust.
Don't just accept them.
Question them. Challenge them. Look for those creative ways to disrupt them, even in small ways.
And remember that playfulness can be a powerful tool.
Graeber saw those giant puppets as such a brilliant way to challenge authority.
With joy and creativity.
Not about anger or aggression.
It was about bringing a sense of fun and playfulness to the resistance.
Find ways to bring that same playfulness into your own life.
Into your work, into your activism.
Don't be afraid to experiment, to think outside the box, to find that joy in the process of challenging the status quo.
So, as we wrap up our deep dive into the world of David Graeber.
What a fascinating journey.
It really was. What would you say is his most enduring legacy? What do we take away from all of this?
I think Graeber's most enduring legacy is his belief in the power of human imagination to create a better world.
That's a good one. He reminded us that the way things are isn't necessarily the way they have to be.
He challenged us to question those dead zones, those areas where we've stopped imagining alternatives.
Where we've just accepted the status quo.
Even when it's unjust or nonsensical.
It's like he was saying, wake up.
Right. Don't just accept the world as it's presented to you.
Use your imagination to envision something better, something more just, more equitable, more playful.
Exactly. He wanted us to see that change is possible.
That we have the power.
That we have the power to shape the world around us.
And that it doesn't have to be this grim, serious process.
It can be joyful.
We can have fun doing it.
Infuse it with a sense of playfulness and adventure.
That's what I loved about his work. It was intellectually rigorous, but also so playful and engaging.
He never lost that sense of wonder.
He made you want to think differently, to see the world with fresh eyes.
And that's a gift. To be inspired to think critically.
To challenge those assumptions.
To imagine those new possibilities.
And he gave us that gift.
It's up to us to carry it forward.
To make the world a little bit brighter.
A little bit more.
And a little bit more playful.
Absolutely.
So to everyone listening out there, don't be afraid to ask those difficult questions, to challenge the status quo, to dream of a better world. And remember, like Graeber said, that capacity for freedom and creativity, it lies within each and every one of us.
It's up to us to tap into that potential and use it to create a future that is more just, more equitable, and filled with the joy of creating something new.